Thank you for inviting me. I've had a wonderful time here. Last week I was up at Lamington hiking in the rain for 4 days. I'm going to make one big point today, so we could be finished very quickly, but then I'll present the evidence on that point. And the point is that there's more than one type of intimate partner violence, and the differences among the types are huge. And that if we don't make distinctions among these types, we make huge mistakes in our research and in our interventions. This is the way things will be organized today. For my presentation, I'm going to start with the gender debate that Heather already mentioned. The first National Family Violence Survey in 1975 found roughly equal perpetration of intimate partner violence by men and women. And then the infamous article by Suzanne Steinmetz, The Battered Husband Syndrome, leapt to the conclusion from those data that there were as many battered husbands as there are battered wives. And of course, people working in the trenches on domestic violence, in shelters, and in police, and in hospital emergency rooms, rose up pretty quickly and said that can't be. We know that it's not like that. And thus began what has now been almost 40-year debate on the gender symmetry issue in intimate partner violence. When I first started working on this gender symmetry issue over 20 years ago, I was stunned that after 20 years of research, we still hadn't answered, evidently, the basic question of who commits intimate partner violence. Now it's been 40 years, and some people still don't understand what the situation is with regard to gender and intimate partner violence. But I think I can convince you today that the answer is fairly simple. How is it, though, that after 40 years we're still arguing about this? The answer to that is that there are two bodies of legitimate social science research on the gendering of intimate partner violence that come to completely different conclusions about gender symmetry and asymmetry. People who argue that that intimate partner violence is roughly gender symmetric in terms of perpetration present evidence from general survey samples. The general survey samples, this is the way I'll be presenting data pretty much all throughout my presentation. I won't present just one study. I'll give you examples of what are hundreds of studies using survey data that show that there's rough gender symmetry in intimate partner violence. These are studies done in different countries, different years, by different researchers, using different operationalizations of violence. I find general gender symmetry, roughly half of the intimate partner violence perpetrated by men, roughly half by women. For younger samples, even more women are involved in intimate partner violence in this research than men. On the other side, people who argue that men are the primary batterers present evidence from agency samples. Here again, a smattering of studies among hundreds done in different agency contexts, in different countries, different years, showing that men are the primary perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So you see for partner assaults in New South Wales, in Sweden, protection orders in New Zealand, spousal homicides in Canada. I can show you data from family court, data from emergency rooms, and so on. All show that men are the primary batterers. So how do we reconcile these two bodies of legitimate research? Well, the reconciliation comes from recognizing that there's more than one kind of intimate partner violence, and the two styles of research get at different kinds of intimate partner violence. There's more than one type of partner violence. There's one type that's perpetrated almost entirely by men. There's another type perpetrated almost entirely by women, and a third type perpetrated almost entirely, roughly equally by men and women. And the two major styles of social research are each biased. General survey research is biased by non-response. And the type of intimate partner violence that you work with, for those of you who work in refuges and in law enforcement, encounter primarily a type of intimate partner violence that involves a pattern of coercive control, and those people don't respond to survey research. So the non-respondents in survey research wipe out all of the intimate partner violence that you're working with in your work and leave only the other type of violence, the situational couple violence, that's perpetrated roughly equally by men and women. So the reason we have these two contrasting bodies of evidence is because of sampling bias in both kinds of research. In general survey research, non-response keeps out the heavily male-perpetrated type of intimate partner violence. And the agency data tend to deal primarily with the coercive controlling violence that's the most likely to come to the attention of neighbors, to lead to injuries that bring people to the emergency rooms, to lead to divorce proceedings as people try to escape that kind of violence. So now I'm going to present the evidence from a variety of studies. This is just a selection of studies, but there are quite a few other studies that show the same pattern of results. I'll encourage you to not pay too much attention to the precise numbers. We like to give numbers because it looks precise. Our numbers aren't always terribly precise, but what you'll see is that over a variety of studies, the patterns are the same, although the numbers may differ slightly depending on sampling, operationalizations, and so on. So let me now briefly explain the control-based typology that I think captures the three major types of intimate partner violence. This typology is not a typology of individual incidents. It's not incident-focused. In order to distinguish among these types of violence, you have to look at the role of the violence in the relationship. Look at how the dynamics of the relationship produce the violence. There are three major types. There are other smaller types, but the three major types are intimate terrorism. That involves a pattern of violent coercive control. That dominates what we see in law enforcement and other agency settings. There's violent resistance, in which the victim of intimate terrorism responds with violence of her own or his own, although it's primarily women. And there's situational couple violence, which involves arguments that escalate to violence by one or both of the partners in the relationship. I'll remind you that the distinction here is not one of severity. The distinction is one of the role of the violence in the relationship in terms of whether or not there's a pattern of coercive control. Intimate terrorism involves a pattern of violent coercive control. So in order to identify it, you need to know not only about the violence in the relationship, but also about the control tactics of the perpetrator of the violence. It involves the use of multiple tactics for controlling, including both violent and nonviolent tactics. Most of you have probably seen the power and control wheel. I'm not putting it up for discussion today because we don't have much time, but that's the pattern. You have a perpetrator who uses violence when necessary, and that violence establishes an aura of threat and terror that makes the nonviolent control tactics of humiliation and abuse, economic control, isolation from others, threats to turn you into immigration services, a whole variety of control tactics, even more effective because those nonviolent control tactics take on the aura of the danger of violence. If my partner's beaten me into unconsciousness once in our relationship, and then a month later says, I want you home by 4 o'clock every day or you'll pay for it, that threat carries real meaning because there's been violence in the relationship. So the pattern of coercive control takes on a terrorizing aspect. The specific controls will vary from case to case, depending upon what kinds of control tactics will work in the particular relationship. In same-sex relationships, for example, someone might threaten to out their partner to people that they don't want to be out to as a means of controlling them. In immigrant populations, threats about immigration services can be effective. And so the tactics are chosen to effectively control one's partner. In heterosexual relationships, this coercive controlling violence, or what I call intimate terrorism, is perpetrated primarily, although not exclusively, by men. So here is where you see strong gender asymmetry in terms of perpetration. In heterosexual relationships, it's primarily men who are intimate terrorists, with a few women also able to use these kinds of tactics to attempt to control their male partners. It's generally rare in the population, but relatively common in agency situations. So we see a good deal of intimate terrorism. In fact, I work in the shelter movement in the United States, and in our training, we basically train almost entirely on intimate terrorism. The power and control wheel is our model of what intimate partner violence is about. Although we recognize that a minority of the cases that come to us are severe situational couple violence that need a different kind of intervention than the intimate terrorism that we see as the primary motivation for coming to the shelter for help. All right, I'm not inviting questions here right now because we're really constrained in terms of our time. So I'll move on to the second major type of intimate partner violence. We see this primarily among women. It's resisting the intimate terrorist, and because most of the intimate terrorists are men, most of the violent resistors are women. In the United States, now with our pro and mandatory arrest policies in various jurisdictions, more and more women are being arrested for intimate partner violence. Many of those women are involved in violent resistance. Many victims of intimate terrorism respond with violence. This violence is not necessarily self-defense, although sometimes it is. Sometimes it's retaliatory. Sometimes it's a matter of saying, I simply won't take it. I don't think I can defend myself, but I'm not going to stand for being attacked physically by my partner without fighting back with violence of my own. However, in heterosexual relationships, most violent resistors desist because the violent resistance is not effective, and the evidence suggests that it often makes things worse as the intimate terrorist escalates his violence in order to physically control his physically resisting partner. So most violent resistors desist and turn to other tactics to try to mitigate the violence. Tactics such as compliance, do whatever he wants, try to anticipate his needs, is one of the major tactics. Learning how to diffuse his violence, other tactics, or beginning to take steps to try to escape safely from the relationship. You can't simply walk out of a relationship like this. These are dangerous men who often threaten to kill you and the children if you try to leave, and in fact often do that when women do try to leave. So it takes time and preparation to get out of such a relationship, to prepare yourself economically, to care for your children when you leave, and to get out of the relationship safely. This kind of intimate partner violence is rare, but again, relatively common in agency settings as we encounter women who are resisting their intimate terrorist partners. The third and by far most common kind of intimate partner violence is situational couple violence. It involves conflicts in the relationship that turn to arguments that escalate to verbal aggression that ultimately escalate to violence. Both men and women are involved in this kind of violence, roughly equally in terms of perpetration. But when we talk about gender symmetry, we often just say broadly that there's gender symmetry in situational couple violence. That's not really true. There's gender symmetry only in terms of perpetration. When you ask people, have you ever thrown something at your partner or struck your partner? But men and women are equally likely to say, yes, I have. It's a minority of men and women who say yes, but it's roughly equal for men and women. But the consequences of that violence are dramatically different for men and women. Men's violence, men's situational couple violence is more likely to injure and more likely to terrify their partner. So you want to keep in mind that although there's gender symmetry in perpetration of situational couple violence, the consequences of that violence differs dramatically by gender. There's huge variability in the nature of situational couple violence. For about 40% of the cases of situational couple violence, there's only been one incident. The couple, one or both members of the couple were violent during an argument, were horrified at what they did, the couple addressed the issue, dealt with it, and they're never violent again. Nevertheless, they show up in the survey research because you ask, has either of you hit the other one in the previous 12 months? They say yes. You follow them up a year later, you find that there's been no violence. However, because of the variability in situational couple violence, some couples get involved in chronic arguments that regularly escalate to violence, violence that can be extremely serious, even homicidal. So you don't want to fall into the trap of assuming that situational couple violence is minor violence. The difference is in the dynamic that produces the violence. And although on average situational couple violence will be less serious than intimate terrorism, on average, there are many cases of extremely serious, even homicidal situational couple violence. So it's a kind of violence in which we need to intervene. There are variable causes of chronic situational couple violence. Of course, one of the causes is the chronic conflicts that some families experience. That's why rates of situational couple violence are higher in poverty-stricken families than they are in families that are well off. Substance abuse can be involved, anger issues may be involved, communication issues. And if you're going to intervene in situational couple violence, you need to identify what the factors are that are producing this dynamic of escalation to violence and address those issues. It's by far the most common type of intimate partner violence. Roughly one out of 6 families in any 12-month period experienced an incident of situational couple violence. As I pointed out, close to half of those involve only one incident. The others involve a more chronic pattern of escalation to violence. Now let me show you how this produces the gender symmetry debate. I'm going to show you just 2 of the many studies that find this pattern. This is a study, the main data here is a study from Pittsburgh in which we make distinctions among the types by looking at coercive control tactics and taking the violent couples and distinguishing among them in terms of whether they or their partner are involved in a general pattern of coercive control. Intimate terrorism in this particular study is perpetrated 97% of the time by husbands, 3% by wives, so we don't want to forget. Women can be intimate terrorists, although for all of what I presume for you are obvious reasons, women are less likely than men to use this kind of tactic to get their way in relationships. Violent resistance, primarily women. Situational couple violence, roughly gender symmetric in terms of perpetration. Study done in Britain by different researchers using different operationalizations, different kind of sampling frame. Again, find intimate terrorism primarily male, in this case 87%. Violent resistance primarily female, only 10% male. Situational couple violence, roughly gender symmetric. So here's the answer to the gender symmetry question. Coercive, controlling violence or intimate terrorism is primarily male perpetrated in heterosexual relationships. And those are the cases that we see the most of in our agency settings. Situational couple violence, what's going on in families that don't often come into contact with agencies, is roughly gender symmetric in its perpetration. Now let's look at the sampling issue. What you see here in the Pittsburgh study, in the general sample, now looking only at men's violence, the general sample is dominated by situational couple violence. 86% of the violence is situational couple violence. The court sample, these are women filing for protection from abuse order, dominated, but only 2/3 still of the cases are intimate terrorism. Almost 1/3 involve situational couple violence that was frightening enough that the woman asked for protection from abuse order. And in the shelter sample, even more heavily dominated by intimate terrorism. So in the courts and in the shelters, you're going to see primarily male perpetrators. In a general sample, you'll see roughly gender symmetric patterns. So let's talk a bit about what the differences are among these 3 major types of intimate partner violence. Let me start with the big point that intimate terrorism involves a very small part of the population. It may not seem that way to those of you who are working with violent families because you see so much intimate terrorism, but rough estimate would be 2 to 4% of couples have a violent, coercive, controlling partner. Whereas in the general population, situational couple violence is more frequent, still a minority, but you see estimates of roughly 1/6 to 1/8 of the population of couples are involved in any 12-month period in situational couple violence. In shelters, you see the pattern is quite different. Shelters dominated by intimate terrorism, and very little situational couple violence coming into that shelter environment. Let me give you a few numbers from other agency settings. In probation and parole, roughly 30% of the violence. These are figures averaged from a variety, a number of studies. Roughly 30% situational couple violence. In protection from abuse orders in the United States, roughly 30% situational couple violence. In our batterer intervention programs, roughly 40% situational couple violence. In our family courts, roughly 60% situational couple violence. And in the U.S. Army's Family Advocacy Program, 80% situational couple violence. They explain that to me by saying, we're very vigilant in the Army. Any kind of violence gets picked up. And so we're picking up the situational couple violence more than other agencies do because we're out there looking for it in order to intervene early. I have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to rush a little bit here. Let's look at the differences in the actual violence. Intimate terrorism in the Pittsburgh study, 76% of the cases involved severe violence. For situational couple violence, only 28% involved severe violence. So that's a huge difference by social science standards. The difference is huge, but don't fall into the trap of ignoring the 28% severe violence in situational couple violence. Just because intimate terrorism is more likely to involve severe violence doesn't mean that situational couple violence cannot, in some cases, involve extremely severe violence. Escalation, we teach in our training at the shelter that I work in. If he hit you once, he'll hit you again, and it's going to escalate. Well, that's true for intimate terrorism. 75% of the cases escalated the violence over time. But it's far from true for situational couple violence. And in fact, more cases of situational couple violence de-escalate than escalate over time. And finally, in terms of the mutuality of the violence, whether both partners are violent or not, for intimate terrorism, there's a relatively low rate of mutuality because the intimate terrorist is determined to maintain control, and so most violent resistors desist over time. Whereas in situational couple violence, you see fairly high rates of mutual violence. One partner slaps the other and gets pushed back, and you have a pattern of mutual violence. Another study that shows huge differences between the two types. Well, I'm looking only here at male violence, by the way. That was true in the previous slide. This is a study done in Canada in which they found that 50% of the cases of intimate terrorism involved frequent violence. Only 8% of the situational couple violence cases involved frequent violence. And that 60% of the women experiencing intimate terrorism in their relationships feared for their lives, as compared to only 9% in the situational couple violence. Again, a reminder, you can't ignore the 9%. So you don't want to be plunking cases into categories and making assumptions about that individual case on the basis of these average differences. You use these types as a guide for your thinking, as a way of looking at the individual cases that are presented to you and asking yourself, what is going on in this relationship and how can we stop the violence? In terms of injuries, again, multiple studies. You've got the numbers printed out, so you don't need to notice the specific numbers right now. What you see is higher rates of negative health outcomes for intimate terrorism than for situational couple violence in a variety of different studies, looking at everything from injuries, post-traumatic stress symptoms, to suicidal behavior, always, on average, more serious consequences for intimate terrorism than for situational couple violence. And again, differences that social scientists sort of gasp at in terms of the size of the differences. Here are some of the patterns over the 40 years of research on intimate partner violence. These are three of the major issues that have been addressed in the literature and on all of these issues there is some confusion about what the results showed. What we're finding now is that the confusion comes from the fact that these risk factors for intimate partner violence are different for intimate terrorism and situational couple violence. For example, in the case of intergenerational transmission, I put it in quotes because there's not really a lot of transmission, there's almost no effect of childhood experiences of violence on the likelihood that you will be involved in situational couple violence as an adult, where there's a relatively robust effect of childhood experiences of violence on whether you're likely to become, for men, this is male violence, to become an intimate terrorist in adulthood. I hasten to add that although the odds are higher of your being an intimate terrorist if you experience childhood violence, it's still a small minority of men who are involved in intimate terrorism. This is not a pattern that's very common among men. Marriage, there's been a debate about whether marriage is a hitting license. In fact, there's a negative relationship between marriage and situational couple violence. Married couples are less likely to be involved in situational couple violence than are couples who are living together unmarried. This is a Canadian study, by the way. Whereas there's a strong positive relationship for intimate terrorism. Married couples are more likely to be involved in intimate terrorism than are couples who are living together unmarried. So one might say, if you want to be cute about it, marriage is a control license, not necessarily a hitting license, but a license to control for some men. And with respect to that, for some men, gender traditionalism, you'll see some of the anti-feminist scholars say there's no relationship between gender traditionalism and intimate partner violence because they look at studies that deal with situational couple violence. And for situational couple violence, there's a very small, basically no relationship, slightly negative, between gender traditionalism and the likelihood of a man being involved in situational couple violence. The slight negative thing may come from a little bit of a chivalry effect, that you don't hit women. But intimate terrorism, a strong positive effect between gender traditionalism and the likelihood of being an intimate terrorist. Now this is from a review study that looked at the entire literature and came up with these numbers as summaries of what was found over a variety of studies. So what you see is dramatic differences in the risk factors for the two different kinds of intimate partner violence. So we've seen that the violence itself is quite different for violence that's embedded in a pattern of power and control versus that isn't. That the consequences are dramatically different. That the gendering of the types is dramatically different. That the likelihood of showing up in various kinds of research studies is quite different. And I could have also shown you studies that show that interventions have different effects for the different types of intimate partner violence. So the big picture here is that there are different types, they have different causes, they have different effects, and we need to be involved in different ways of intervening with the different types of intimate partner violence. What I always end with this slide, and I love a picture of a woman. The photographer who took this picture has a picture of this woman as she came into the shelter, frantic, escaping from an intimate terrorist partner, hiding out for the night in the shelter with her baby, and we caught her asleep later on in the evening. So thank you.